introduction now? Okay.
You could do him now.
Today we are very honored to have with us Jess Edberg. She is the executive director of the Dorothy Moulter Museum in Ely, and she is going to tell us the remarkable story of this very unusual woman and her life in the Boundary Waters. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming today. I feel honored for presenting in a theater. I kind of feel more famous than I should, I think. Is the sound good for everybody? Fantastic, because I can certainly project. Definitely get louder if we need it. Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. I'll try to restrict my movement. I'm a mover when I present. I like to be very active, and so I'll try to tone it down a little bit for this afternoon. But I am very happy to be here to share the story of Dorothy Moulter. She definitely led a very unorthodox life for women of her time. And I really get excited sharing her life story because it's very inspiring to me, and I think it can be really inspiring to other people, not just how she lived her life, but how she affected other people's lives, and how in turn they took care of her. And so I'm going to go through, I have a variety of different slides and imagery with me. If I lose my track, it's only because I like to add new slides every time I do a program, and then I forget which ones I added. So to stop and kind of look, oh yeah, I remember why I put that one in there instead. So we're going to start at the almost beginning of Dorothy's life. She was born in Arnold, Pennsylvania on May 6, 1907 to Charles Cap and Maddie Moulter. Charles' nickname was Cap because he was the police captain for his job at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. It took him away from home for periods of time doing his police work. And Maddie, of course, in 1907, with other children around, was a stay-at-home mom. And so Cap and Maddie total had 6 children. And unfortunately, when Dorothy had just turned 8 years old, her mother passed away during childbirth. This had obviously a very significant effect on Dorothy and her siblings. At that time, it was very difficult for a single father who had a full-time job to take care of children. And with 6 of them, that was quite a job. So what he did was he paired them off, and they went and stayed with various aunts and uncles on both sides of the family. And it was very difficult and very challenging for the children to be happy. They really struggled during this time in their lives, and Charles saw that. And so what he decided to do was move them somewhere where they could still all be together, but that he could still have his job with the railroad. And so they moved from Pennsylvania and started heading west. And they spent some time in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Cap placed those children temporarily in an orphanage. So all the children stayed there. They weren't up for adoption, but it wasn't an uncommon practice at the time, in the mid-19s, for families to do this to get by until usually the father would remarry and have a stepmom for the kids to help raise them. And so that's exactly what happened, is through his travels, Cap met Myrtle Least, and he remarried her. They went and gathered the children up, and they moved further west to, they stopped a couple different places and ended up settling in the Chicago area. And at that time, Dorothy was school age, as many of her siblings were, and they were in a fairly big city. So schooling was available for all children. Dorothy excelled at classwork, and she was also very interested in doing physical activities. So she joined the girls' intramural basketball, tennis, volleyball teams, and was very good on the riflery team. She actually won the citywide sharpshooter championship at the old Chicago Coliseum in 1924 for her girls team. And it's interesting when you know that about her and then look ahead 40 years to her living in the middle of a wilderness, those shooting skills came in really handy for her. So, and this is the target from that championship. So she was a Deadeye. She was pretty good with the firearms. Now, in a very urban setting, she graduated high school. She went to the fairly brand new Calumet High School at that time. I also brought little kind of trivia prizes with me. Hopefully I don't have to throw them up. This is a new setting for me. Calumet High School in the south side of Chicago had another famous Minnesotan graduate from there. He is well known for hitting a lot of home runs for the Minnesota Twins. Anybody have an idea? Kirby Puckett. Kirby Puckett. So we have custom coffee. We have a local coffee roaster in Ely called Gene Hicks, and he makes us a blend called Dorothy's Blend, and it's nice and strong, like we like it. So we'll see what other trivia questions I can come up with. Feel free. We are super informal when we talk at the museum, so it doesn't bother me if people need to move around or get up or whatever. Don't feel like you're going to interrupt me at all. One of the things about Dorothy graduating high school that some of us at the museum ponder is if she had stayed in Pennsylvania, Arnold at the time was a fairly small town, would she have even graduated? Would she have gone past 8th grade? In the 1920s, there were a lot of social changes going on. We think some of those probably influenced the way she viewed life and her personality. She was a very independent person. And we wonder if having not had the opportunity to educate herself, would her life be drastically different? One of the things we know is that she valued education. So instead of deciding to settle down like a lot of her classmates and siblings did after graduation, Dorothy Moulter decided to go into nursing school. So Dorothy enrolled in Auburn Park Teaching Hospital in Chicago and started taking classes on how to help others in the medical field. I often wonder if perhaps the loss of her mother at a young age during childbirth perhaps influenced that choice. But we really have no way of knowing. We don't have any writings from her at that time period in her life. Now, as she was in her second year of nursing school, her father, Cap, decided to go on a fishing trip up to the north wild areas of the Border Lakes region of Minnesota. So right on the border of Minnesota and Ontario. Basswood Lake was very well known for northern pike fishing. Perhaps some of you have been there before. It still is a really good fishing lake for pike. But he went up, and while he was up on this fishing trip, he got word of another fishing resort, a very rustic resort, farther east into the wilderness on Knife Lake. And so the following year, he organized a fishing party of himself, his wife Myrtle, his brother, and 2 of his buddies from the railroad. And they had planned on going up to this Isle of Pines fishing resort the following summer in 1930. Well, the Isle of Pines is a cluster of islands in the middle of Knife Lake, which is a pretty big lake. So this dot is super small, and this is the biggest screen I've ever presented on. But there is one big main island and then 2 small satellite islands that when the water is really low, like right now, this time of the year for us here, I noticed here as well, but over at Ely, the water's fairly low. You could almost walk to them on the rocks, but in the springtime when the water's really high, there were footbridges between those 3 islands. Now, this lake, Knife Lake, is in the Superior National Forest, which was established in 1909 by President Roosevelt, primarily as a game refuge because of the declining moose and caribou, woodland caribou population of Minnesota. And so it was to set aside this landscape as a federal land where you could still use it, you could still harvest timber and do other recreational activities and use it in a practical way, but it was to protect those species of wildlife because they're in a pretty steep decline due to pressure from hunting and the changes of the landscape that timber harvest had created, primarily the movement north of white-tailed deer. Over in Ely, white-tailed deer are not a native species, and so they went into competition with the caribou and the moose and carried some diseases and parasites, which we're still feeling the effect of if you follow moose research in the state of Minnesota, which is a whole nother program. Won't be doing that today. But I certainly could answer a question about it later. So this particular space almost didn't exist. In the late 1920s, there were some interest groups that were fairly wealthy and were involved in energy, so electricity and coal, and they wanted to use this border lakes region for hydroelectric power. And so they had proposed putting in several dams, 80-foot high hydroelectric dams, along the North Country where all of these lakes are connected by rivers to generate energy and make some money. And Congress saw what was happening, and some people worked really hard to prevent it, and so they passed an act. Does anybody know what act that was? It was in 1930. It's several names hyphenated. Ooh. Oh, you're close. It's Shipstead-Nolan-Newton, or Newton-Nolan Act. But basically, this act effectively prevented, you get a pencil. There you go. Prevented the dams from being put on these federal lands, and shortly after, the state of Minnesota passed a sister act that was basically the same thing but for Minnesota waters, and that helped preserve the area that we now refer to as the Boundary Waters Area Wilderness from being flooded and made basically into giant reservoirs. So lucky for us and for Bill Berglund, that didn't happen. Bill, who is Bill? Who is this random Bill guy? Bill was the original owner of the Isle of Pines. Bill had been born in New London, Minnesota in the late 1800s to some good Swedish immigrant stock, just like my family. And no offense to others, but Swedes are kind of rank high with us. He moved north after his wife passed away, and based on some census records and some notes from the Ely-Winton area, what we know is that it's likely his wife died during the Spanish influenza epidemic, and forlorn, he moved up. He got away and came up north and worked trapping and had goals of working in the lumbering industry, but by the time he made it up in about 1919, the timber industry was starting to wane. Timber harvest is a renewable resource, but it takes a long time to renew it. And so he really didn't have work. But what had been happening up in the Ely area was that after World War I, the idea of leisure time and vacationing was becoming more prominent around the country, especially in big cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison. And so because the railroad connected Chicago as a big city hub directly to Ely, a lot of people from that big city would come up to recreate, to get out and go fishing and experience the fresh air for their health. And so Bill Berglund decided to start guiding and taking people hunting and fishing, and eventually he found this little cluster of islands on Knife Lake and purchased it from an official from one of the timber companies. And he built this resort from the ground up. So if you can imagine heading out to this resort, the first cabin that you would see on the big island would be the point cabin, because it's on a point. And this particular cabin had gorgeous views of the sunset, but got pretty battered by storms that would come in from the west. This is a later image. This is actually from the 1980s, but it's the only close-up image of this cabin that we have from when it was out there. But they were very rustic, even, you know, more rustic than you would imagine it could be. You know, the chinking between the logs was good, but when you live in the middle of a wilderness, all manner of rodents and small mammals can find their way in the tiniest little crack. So most of the cabins were very similar. They had a front middle entrance into a porch area, and then a door that went into more of a living space. And depending on how big the cabin was, it might be just a wood stove in the middle of the room, and a bed and some other furniture, or you might actually have separate rooms for sleeping and for gathering. So this was the Point cabin. Two other cabins on the same island were kind of sprinkled intermittently. So they were all connected by trails. A lot of our pictures are really old, go figure. And so they're not as clear and crisp as we would like them to be, but there's a dirt trail kind of right up the middle of the photo. And the first cabin in the kind of in the middle of the woods there is the Trapper cabin. And then the one on the other side of the island was the Winter cabin. And the Winter cabin was set back from the western shore, or excuse me, the eastern shoreline, and was the ideal cabin to stay in for Bill in the winter time because it had very good shelter, but it still had a beautiful view of Knife Lake through a little bit of a yard that was out there. And this is the front of the Winter cabin. I'll talk a little bit about the actual museum that we have in Ely at the end of the program, but we have at the museum the Point cabin and the Winter cabin as primary cabin exhibits. It looks a little bit different because when you take apart a log cabin and put it back together, some things have to be adjusted and changed. But this is the cabin Dorothy spent most of her time in once she ended up on the Isle of Pines. Footbridges connecting to the smaller two islands varied throughout the years, but most of them just had kind of a log cabin style cribbing to hold them up out of the water, but still be stable when the ice would come in the wintertime, and then just planks run across. The railings were probably added a little bit later. And then I should say the other cabin that was out there, it's at the other end of this. This was the Cady cabin, C-A-D-Y. This was built much later. Bill Berglund built the other three cabins in the late 1920s. They were there when Dorothy first went up. But the Cady cabin came along a little bit later, and here's a little side story, is that when you wanted to make a reservation for going to any one of these resorts, a lot of the resort owners, because they were way out in the middle of nowhere, off the grid, no phone, no water, no electricity, they would coordinate with somebody back at one of the lakes that you could access by road. And so someone else would help take care of the reservations, and then Bill would just have the guests come. And one time this gentleman, whose last name was Cady, showed up, and there was a mix-up in his reservation. And he was fairly wealthy and decided that that would never happen again, and he financed the construction of a cabin just for him that he had a standing reservation at every year just to be safe. But of course it benefited the Isle of Pines Fishing Resort because, hey, now we have another cabin, we can have more guests coming. So that worked out really well. So in Dorothy, the way that she ended up going, if I haven't mentioned it already, was that this party that Cap had organized to go on this fishing trip in 1930, one of his buddies had to back out. And Dorothy, having just finished her third year of nursing school, was on summer break and did not have work and was able to go, and she was a perfect fit. And so she came up with her family. They took the train from Chicago up to Ely, and then got in a vehicle, which was most likely a Model T, drove the rest of the way to the Moose Lake Landing, where that's as far as they could go. That was about 15 miles out of town. From then, they had to get in canoes and then paddle the remaining 15 miles over 5 portages to get to the Isle of Pines on Knife Lake. So this wasn't just a leisurely vacation to relax. This was an adventure. You're going on this travel adventure, and Dorothy absolutely loved it. The first day they were there, they were settling into their cabin. We think they stayed in the Point cabin. And she was putting some clothes up on a shelf, and a chipmunk jumped off the shelf. And she obviously had never experienced that before. And so she let out a little yelp, and Bill Berglund, who had been coming over to check and see if they were settling in well, stopped in and basically informed her, well, yes, this is to be expected. This is a normal thing. And he said, you want to see something else? Come on outside. And he grabbed a crust of bread and held his arm out, and a Canada jay came and landed on his hand and started pecking at that bread. And Dorothy was just amazed. Like, is everything this tame? Is this what it's going to be like this whole entire trip? And he said, no, not everything, but the jays, the chickadees, the chipmunks, the red squirrels, they're pretty tame. They could be food conditioned pretty easily. And so it made a huge impact on her, so that she has told this story to other people that she met. Later that afternoon, she took a walk around the island and encountered more wildlife, specifically a mink, a kingfisher, and a beaver. She heard her first loon call, and that moment, we think she knew she was going to be coming back. And so that's exactly what happened. She spent those couple of weeks on the Isle of Pines with her family. The family had such a good time that they decided to keep coming back. And so the following year, after Dorothy had passed her board exams for becoming a fully fledged nurse, came up just very confident in her skills and wanted to learn everything that she could. Bill Berglund was 33 years her senior, but they had quite a bit in common when it came to living out in the woods or enjoying the natural beauty and the wildlife that were around them. And they became very good friends very quickly, to the point where Dorothy started working for Bill. Now, this was during the Great Depression, so it wasn't necessarily that Dorothy chose this life immediately, but she didn't have full-time work back home. So this was one way to fill those summer months where she wasn't working, and then go back down to Chicago during the winter time, which Christmas was her favorite holiday, so she always made a point to go down to Chicago and visit family. But then she could also pick up shifts at the teaching hospital when other students were gone for the holidays. And so this kind of became a pattern until the summer of 1934. She decided, that's it, I'm going to stick around, I'm going to stay. And so she did. She finished up and ended up staying up with Bill Berglund. Now, I'm guessing some of you are probably wondering, what kind of relationship did they really have? And you wouldn't be the only ones. In fact, for a long time, there were a lot of rumors about Dorothy's relationship with Bill, what they were doing up there, whether it was appropriate or unbecoming of a young woman and an older man. But what we know from a couple of her very dear friends who actually volunteered at the museum, they were the founders of the museum, that there was never a romantic relationship between them. And based on their conversations, we estimate that it was probably more of a father figure relationship or a mentor relationship that they had. And we do know that Dorothy had no intention of getting married. She had never expressed an interest in having children. Again, with the passing of her mother at such a young age, and then having to help raise 3 younger siblings throughout her childhood, might have had something to do with that choice. But she was asked at one time in her 40s, why haven't you ever married? And her response to them, and this was a journalist, so we actually published it, was, when I find a man who can chop more wood, portage heavier loads, or catch more fish, I'll marry him. We can only assume that nobody ever met those standards. Something to aspire to for any single gentleman out there. Now, Bill Berglund's health started to decline fairly quickly in the 40s. Bill ended up passing in 1948 from what we estimate to be congestive heart failure based on records. And prior to his passing, he had offered Dorothy a business proposal, essentially making her a partner in the resort business, but then also asking her to be his personal nurse during these last few years. And so that's exactly what she did, is she stayed on the islands year-round, starting sometime in the early 1940s, where prior to that, she was staying at the resort up until wintertime, where she had to leave before the ice formed, and staying in Winton, which, does anybody know where Winton is? I didn't expect anybody to know. It's basically, it's 3 miles from Ely. It's actually more the end of the road town than Ely is, but Ely is the big, fun, cute town that people go to visit. Winton is kind of, it's a one road and it has a municipal liquor store. So that's its claim to fame. But back in the day, Winton was actually the town. It was the hub. It was bigger than Ely because Winton had the lumber mill. And so when the lumber industry declined, iron ore had been discovered in Ely. 5 iron ore mines were then established, and people literally picked up their houses and carted them over to Ely. And so Winton's population declined significantly, and Ely blossomed into a mining town / tourist attraction town. Now, when Bill died, he had fully intended on legally passing on this property to Dorothy, but he did not have a will. However, his family that still lived in Minnesota were very well aware of how good of a friend Dorothy had been and how well she'd taken care of their brother, and so they deeded the property to her. And she became the sole owner-proprietor of a wilderness fishing resort at the age of 41. So in 1948, being a businesswoman was kind of unusual, let alone in the wilderness, 15 miles from the nearest road, and you're a nurse. So this was kind of a novelty. It was interesting for a lot of people, especially journalists, and I'll get to a little bit of that in a moment. But something that really started a snowball rolling down the hill that affected Dorothy was the Ty-Blotnick Act of 1948. Now, this particular act allocated or appropriated government funds to the U.S. Forest Service to purchase private land holdings, specifically resorts and private lands like hunting camps or fishing shacks, within the Superior Roadless area, also known as the Boundary Waters. It also provided, in lieu of tax dollars, to Lake, St. Louis, and Cook counties for state lands or county lands within that area. So there was this kind of arrangement between the county level government and the feds to have some cost savings and cost sharing. And so basically, once this happened, the Forest Service started contacting all of the resort owners in the area with offers to buy them out. Now, the act was passed early in the year, and Bill Berglund passed in March. So the Forest Service had already caught wind that Bill was not well. And so in an internal memo, and I won't read the whole thing, but essentially it's saying, Bill Berglund's probably not going to live a lot longer. Maybe we should offer to buy him out now and grant him lifetime tenancy. Because he's going to die anyway. So, hey, let's just do this. So the interesting thing is that they actually said these things in an official memo of the Forest Service, probably not thinking that the Freedom of Information Act would ever be invented. But thanks for us, it was, and we were able to obtain copies of all of these correspondence letters, both within the Forest Service and to Dorothy. And so what they didn't know was, Bill already made a promise, and Bill's honored that promise. And so then the Forest Service found out, Bill Berglund passed away, and now we have to try to get Dorothy to sell this land. And their discussions we're basically, well, let's offer her $3,000. Now, the islands that she had inherited were roughly 10 to 13 acres, depending on the measurements. We've got various information we've received, but we have not ever gone out and actually measured it. So, let's say it was 10 acres. $3,000 for 10 acres is not unheard of, but on a very productive trout fishing lake that has beautiful, clear, deep, cold water, it's already has an established resort business on it that's very successful. It was a little bit of an insult for Dorothy when she received the first correspondences. Unfortunately, controversy kind of just started snowballing after that. And the following year, President Truman signed an executive order banning all flights below 4,000 feet in the roadless area. Well, at that time, float planes were the taxis of the North. They were hauling in guests, they were hauling in supplies, they were taking in anything and everything that a resort owner or a fishing camp person wanted to do in the area where you couldn't drive to. For example, if you were living in Ely and working at one of the 5 mines and you happened to have an afternoon off from work, you could hop on a plane off of Shagwa Lake right down in Ely and fly up to Knife Lake for the afternoon to go fishing or to visit Dorothy. And then they'd pick you up and bring you back. So what this did was it not only affected the business owners that had to bring in supplies, it also affected the working people of the community that used it as an opportunity to take some free time for themselves, which wasn't very often. So Dorothy, this is a picture of her father, Cap, on the left, and Dorothy next to him, and then some unknown guests that were there. Had to make some choices over what she was going to start or stop bringing in to her fishing resort. Because the only other way now was by boat and hauling everything over those 5 portages, or in the wintertime by dog sled. And so crates of soda pop, like these ones on the right side of the picture, were something that was eliminated right off of her shopping list. And so she decided, you know what, my guests coming up, if they want soda pop, they can bring it themselves. I am not going to haul crates of pop over portages, and I'm not going to ask any of my friends or colleagues to do that for me. They're coming here to fish. They don't need to have this. And so her shopping list was pared down to be a much more practical list of things that were necessary, not exactly things that were fun to have anymore. Now, Dorothy continued to get letters from the Forest Service, and every time they would send out a letter, she would promptly either ignore it, which happened quite a bit, put it in the wood stove, or respond fairly curtly to it. And what ended up happening at this time in her life was, and a lot of things happened to Dorothy about the same time. 1948 was that catalyst year, and things just started spiraling. And so as soon as she took over, and I mentioned that the fact of who she was and her education and her single status was very interesting to a lot of people, people started wanting to go and talk to her and find out more about her. And Andrew Hamilton was a writer for the Saturday Evening Post, and he decided he was going to make a trip and go up and interview Dorothy Moulter and find out who this mysterious, unorthodox woman was. And so he published an article in the October '52 issue called "The Loneliest Woman in America." And of course, journalists, especially, in magazines, like to make their story exciting. And as what happened with Dorothy quite a bit was her life was romanticized, and it was exaggerated quite a bit, because Dorothy Moulter lives absolutely alone on a remote 10-acre island in the northeastern Minnesota wilderness. Even male sportsmen don't dare face the 50 below winters there without any, quote, civilized conveniences, but the lady likes it that way. So let's unpack this for a moment. She's not absolutely alone. She definitely is running a business where people come to her and stay with her. So her resort business was thriving. She was still operating it, having guests come. More people were stopping by to visit because she was an interesting person and people wanted to be exposed to her and learn more about her. And she had a lot of friends in the Ely community. It didn't take long when she started working for Bill Berlin to develop a very strong reputation for being a hard worker, very ethical, very kind, and very plain spoken. You know, she's going to tell it the way it is. A little bit gently, but she's not going to sugarcoat it too much if she needs to tell you what you need to hear. And so calling her the loneliest woman in America was very much the opposite of the actual situation. And 50 below, yes, it can get 50 below, but how often does that happen? You know, 40 below maybe a couple days last winter, but you know, usually that's with wind chill. So embellishing the stories, making her seem like this bigger than, larger than life character, basically fueled this small little fire to this giant bonfire. And this article started off this steady parade of journalists coming up to visit Dorothy. And the publicity that was generated from all of these different articles featuring Dorothy and talking about Dorothy's life really came in handy for her later on when she almost lost the property. Dorothy had a lot of friends and supporters, and they were extremely generous and fought very hard for her anytime anybody questioned her ability or whether she should be doing what she was doing. But one of the things that really endeared people to her, especially people she didn't even know, was the fact that she made homemade root beer. So now we've got this single woman running a wilderness resort. She's a nurse who, by the way, every year at Christmas when she goes home to visit her family in Chicago, continues to work at the teaching hospital so that she can maintain her training and most of her credentials throughout much of her life. So not only was she a trained nurse, she was current on the training that was required at that time. And now she's making root beer. So just this magnet for reporters to want to talk to this woman living this crazy life that they could never have imagined on their own. And so the fact that she started making root beer increased exponentially the amount of visitors that started coming to see her because for whatever reason, in the DVD that I brought with, it was actually a documentary that was filmed while Dorothy was still alive and then produced and released after she died in 1987. But she says in the video, she's like, I don't know how I got the idea, but I got the idea to make root beer. And all of those empty bottles in those heavy wooden crates lying around got repurposed and came in handy to give her a practical, what's that?
I said, I know why she did it,
Why that?
because they couldn't carry all that soda.
Exactly. Yeah. So, like many women and men that grew up, especially in the generation that survived the Great Depression, you don't waste things that you have, you reuse things. And so taking the root beer bottles that she already had lying around, which she had hundreds, she went into town, she purchased herself a bottle capper, she got A&W syrup from the A&W restaurant, and bought bags and bags of sugar and jars of yeast. And came back, had a very basic root beer recipe, and using Knife Lake water, made a tasty beverage. Depending on who you talk to. Has anybody ever had any of Dorothy Molter's original root beer? What
I
did it
have.
taste like?
I thought it was good.
It was good.
You were on a hot day in a canoe, and it tasted wonderful.
Yes. Any other comments? Yes?
Yeah, the bottles might be Orange Crush or 7-Up. It was quite a variety of bottles.
Yeah. Any people think it tasted terrible?
No.
No. You don't have to be nice. So we, at the museum, we have people stop in and chat with us about their visits with Dorothy, and it's all across the spectrum, from it was the most delicious thing that they had ever tasted, to it was the most atrocious thing they could have imagined tasting. But all of the flavor, tasting, and judgment is directly correlated with how many days they had been camping already. Every single time. Now, the inconsistency of her root beer is definitely true. In fact, especially in her later years when she was having huge amounts of people coming every day, upwards of 200 people per day, she would go through crates of this root beer. And sometimes she would have a crate of root beer that she had just made in the ice house yesterday, and then she had to pull it out today to serve. And has anybody ever made homemade root beer? Using yeast and sugar, you don't drink it the next day. It needs to sit for at least 2 days, sometimes 3, for that yeast to ferment with the sugar and not have that yeasty flavor, but also have a little bit of carbonation. And so if, you were an unlucky traveler that stopped by the Isle of Pines for a root beer on a Tuesday and she just made the batch on Monday, you're kind of out of luck. But Dorothy would start making root beer as soon as the temperatures were about freezing overnight in the spring, and then make it through almost to ice up in the fall. And the last 10 years of her life were pretty busy root beer making years. She got a lot of mileage on on articles about her being the root beer lady after that. We know that it was after 1952 that she started making the root beer, but we don't know the exact year. We base that on all of these publications that went up to interview her. And the publications don't mention root beer until the very earliest, 1953. So that was a long stretch, over 30 years of making root beer. Now, along this same time, in the 50s, technology improved and transportation started to improve. And in the mid-50s, specifically 1954, a group of travelers with wind sleds stopped up, went across from Ely over to the Gunflint Trail on wind sleds, which basically it's kind of like a snowmobile, but with a big fan on the back of it. But this era was fairly short-lived because very quickly after, two brothers down in Hinckley, Minnesota, came up and with the idea of a snow machine that actually had an engine built into it to propel some kind of a track that would move this machine forward. And so this one, in 1954, is one of the very first snowmobiles, and Dorothy got one of the first commercially produced snowmobiles. This is a Polaris Snow Traveler, and this is her dad, who promptly commandeered it as his own personal transportation device. The snowshoes on the front were a necessary part of the package because those early snowmobiles were incredibly heavy. Not that they're light now, but they were very heavy, and they got bogged down if you had any kind of slush. And slush is fairly common, especially with all the water over by Ely, and especially the border lakes. They're all connected by moving water, rivers and streams, and so there's always some kind of current and a crack in the ice big enough to get that water to come up. You rarely have a winter where you don't have some slush on the lakes. And so they added a crank on the back of it. So the engine was in the back, but then this little wheel would help push down, and you could raise up the track out of the slush kick off and clear off all the ice that had built up from the slush and then lower it back down and be on your way. But sometimes the slush was too bad and you'd get bogged down and stuck and then you'd freeze. So you had to walk to go get help. So the snowshoes were kind of your backup plan. We actually have this snowmobile in our Point Cabin exhibit at the museum. So if you ever make it over Ely Way and you want to check this out, we certainly have it. But snow machines drastically changed the way that people traveled in the wintertime, especially up where Dorothy was. She would have visitors, but usually it was dog sled or snowshoe or ski. And Dorothy had no problem snowshoeing down to Moose Lake Landing and staying with friends that had homes there or catching a ride into Ely Town to pick up her mail or get her groceries or pay her accounts. But now people could come and see her and they could do it very quickly. And it didn't take long for her to get another snowmobile once they became available. And people around the area, especially Grand Marais, Babbitt, Ely, Winton, started to form snowmobile clubs. The Ely Igloo Snowmobile Club claims to be the first one in the nation. I don't know if any of you want to argue that. You guys have a snowmobile club over here. But what they started doing was they would plan Dorothy Days. And in the wintertime, each snowmobile club would sponsor a weekend. And they would give Dorothy a bunch of advance notice so that she was aware of what was going on. And they would plan snowmobile trips up for ice cutting parties. So now, back before the snowmobiles, it was whoever she could round up to snowshoe or ski up and see her and help. But now that snowmobiles were there, hundreds of people could show up. And she could get all of her ice put up in almost one day doing this. Anybody here ever put ice up? It's a lot of work. And it's slippery. And sometimes it's really, really cold. Dorothy did a lot of the work herself, even throughout into her later years. But throughout all of this, the Forest Service was just constantly trying to convince her to sell her property. In this particular letter from 1960, they actually included a purchase and seller agreement form completely filled out. All she had to do was sign it and return it. Guess where that one ended up? Then they sent her another letter and made her an offer of $15,000, $500, and lifetime tenancy. Now looking back, this might have been a really good choice for Dorothy to have made, because she would not have had the stress and the anxiety over whether or not she was going to be able to stay on her property. But she decided to decline it. She thought her property was worth at least $100,000 with the business and the property. So the Forest Service said, okay, well, then we're going to give you one last firm offer, nothing else included, $19,500. Right. In the postscript down at the bottom, it's a little difficult to see, but basically it tells her if you want to negotiate tenancy, this price will go down based on your occupancy. And again, she declined. And so after that, the Forest Service basically said, you know what? You are giving us no choice. If you refuse to sell your property, we have no choice but to initiate condemnation processes. And so essentially they said, you know what? Too bad, so sad. You didn't sell your property. Now we are going to take it from you. And so if you can imagine how Dorothy might have felt, a bunch of other resort owners and private property owners were also going through this process. There's one resort owner in particular, if you've ever been to the Ely area, you've probably heard the name Zoop or Zup. They had a fishing resort on the border lakes, and they got so frustrated that they closed up shop and they took their entire business and moved to Ontario. So they would not be giving any money to the federal government of the United States with their business. But this was an extremely contentious time in the Ely area. It was a very difficult time because any kind of government agency is going to have field offices. And the Forest Service of the U.S., based out in Washington, D.C., of course, had an Ely ranger station. So the Ely folks were not making these choices up. It was the folks in Washington, D.C., and the folks that worked in the Ely office had worked with all of these people for their entire lives. They were members of the community, their kids went to the same school, and now this is what they have to do to their neighbors. And so it was a very complex issue that polarized a lot of the community and made it just really challenging for everybody involved. Shortly thereafter, let's see, this one, it was in 1964. The Forest Service had been going up to visit Dorothy and let her know this is what's going to happen, this is what's going on, and this person sent an internal memo detailing his most recent visit to Dorothy Moulter, where he says, when I was leaving on April 13th, Miss Moulter made the statement that she does not especially like to see me come to visit her, and that I am becoming sort of a pest with my frequent calls to discuss purchase. She says she likes to have visitors, but she does not like the reasons for my visits. And I have heard rumor from people who knew her that she had met him in the doorway with her shotgun. That might be embellishing. Yes, sir.
And that second carbon copy that starts with a K,
Mhm.
because I saw that it's appeared several times to me. So
Kawishui. Kawishui is the word where the little check is. That is what the ranger station is referred to. It's the Kawishui Ranger District, named after the Kawishui River. The Kawishui River is the major river that flows near and around the Ely area and connects most of the lakes in the Boundary Waters. There's a Kawishui Lake as well. Basically, it's an Ojibwe term referring to a body of water with either many beaver huts or many muskrat huts. Little tangent history story there. Now, in 1964, the other big thing that happened was the Wilderness Act finally passed. I'm not sure if any of you ever followed the process of the Wilderness Act, but it was fairly lengthy. Discussions about and drafts of the Wilderness Act started in the 50s, but it wasn't until 64 that that particular draft gained enough traction to make it to Congress and be passed. Interestingly enough, Sigurd Olson was one of the early people involved in drafting the Wilderness Act. He was also living in Ely at the time, and similar to Dorothy, he had moved up from out of the area, and his actions had directly affected Dorothy now twice. Because the first time, he was heavily involved with the flight ban of 1949. Now, regardless of the hardship that it created Dorothy with these two different actions, they actually did remain cordial. Dorothy respected him, but wasn't necessarily going to go out of her way to be friendly with him. And he gave her a signed copy of his book, The Singing Wilderness, which we have in a new exhibit about the Boundary Waters. But Sigurd Olson was not really well liked by a lot of people in Ely because of the things that he was doing. And in fact, he was liked even less in the late 1970s, which I'll get to that part of it. But it's easy to boil it down to, one side versus the other, but it was so much more complex, and I don't have enough time to really go into the details of it, which is why we have an actual whole new exhibit just on the Boundary Waters. But the wilderness was an area where Dorothy lived, was an area that people utilized, residents utilized, people did business there, they had resorts. But at the same time, what a gift to be able to set aside all of this beautiful wilderness landscape for future generations. And so it was really hard for people to see both sides and kind of talk about the challenges. And the way that government did business back then was really different than it is now, or even 10 years ago. It was a very difficult time, and when the Wilderness Act finally passed, it was kind of like this big nail, so to speak, in that proverbial coffin for Dorothy, because this meant there's actual law now that says it's illegal for her to be living there. The definition of a federal wilderness basically referred to it as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. And the way that that was interpreted was that nobody can be a permanent resident and nobody can operate a business within that wilderness area. And both of those things are what Dorothy was doing. Now what it did do was across the US, it protected 9 million acres of land for public use, so it belongs to all of us now. And just over 1 million of those acres are the boundary waters. So it's this double-edged sword, you know, and if you look back and you think about the process, probably could have been handled a little differently, maybe a little better, maybe with more collaboration and open communication. But it didn't, and we have the wilderness now, and so we can hopefully learn from the methods that were used back then and move forward in better ways. But for Dorothy, she tried to continue to do what she always did, and all of that media attention came back and provided leverage for Dorothy. Now, Dorothy herself didn't exercise that leverage. Her friends did. One of her friends, Bob Carey, who after Dorothy passed, published a book of short stories about Dorothy based on his memories of her, called The Root Beer Lady, which is the one publication that everybody that's heard of Dorothy is more familiar with that one than the biography book that I have with today. And that's okay. Bob was a great writer. But what he also was, just like Dorothy and just like Sigurd Olson, was he was a transplant. He actually came up from Chicago as well and moved to Ely and became a resident and worked for the Ely Timber Jay newspaper, which still exists today. But he had formerly been the editor of a very large Chicago paper that no longer exists, and he wrote an editorial detailing the trial that Dorothy has been going through over just wanting to live her life and stay on Knife Lake. And so he got it published in the Chicago paper he used to work for and the local papers. Well, it got picked up on the National Newswire, and it went all over. And combined with her previous notoriety, and then with this article talking about, oh my gosh, remember that lady we told you about? Look what's happening to her. And the Forest Service received thousands of letters in support of Dorothy, petitions with tens of thousands of signatures on them to allow Dorothy to stay. And ultimately, the Forest Service was able to negotiate and come up with a way to make it happen. And so because it was a federal wilderness, eventually what they had to do was make it official at the federal level. And so I believe it was a senator from Indiana put on the table a bill which was referred to as Bill for the Relief of Dorothy Moulter, which was fully supported by our past guy, Hubert Humphrey. And although it doesn't show up in the official records, this was taken and then added into other legislation and allowed Dorothy to stay on her property at the legal level. So there was a period of time where she was only granted temporary stay, but then after 1972, she was granted permanent tenancy. And so imagine the publicity she was receiving this whole time. Well, that translated into more and more people coming by. And so she ended up the last 10 years of her life up there, from about 76 to 86, she had between 6,000 and 7,000 people stopping by to visit her. And she made between 11 and 12,000 bottles of root beer every year. Yeah, that's a lot of work, but she had help. That previous slide, that's her great nephew Steve. Although Dorothy was married, her siblings did, and they all had children, and then their children had children, and once the children were of age to be able to go up and spend a couple weeks with Aunt Dot, then they would go, and it was their opportunity to visit, but then they also had to help. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with a certain phrase called "quit your belly aching." Dorothy employed that very much, and I could not find my photo of Dorothy with this sign, but it's on the pencil that I gave out. But it's "quit your belly aching," but it is spelled KWITCHURBELIAKIN. Think of it like Kawishawee. It looks a lot like Kawishawee, and Dorothy's brother, Bud, made a sign that said "quit your belly aching," but spelled it in that way intentionally to trick people into thinking it was some Ojibwe term for perhaps later. I also think he was poking fun at Dorothy because she said it so much, and it's got a lot of longevity because it's still working today at the museum. 9 out of 10 people come into the museum and ask us to tell them what it is, and then we make them try to pronounce it, and then we tell them. The one big last motion that really significantly limited Dorothy's ability to connect with the outside world, outside of Knife Lake, was the Boundary Waters. Can you act? That is BWCA, Boundary Waters Canoe Area, sorry. It's like hard. That was the 78 Act. So it was a partner or a sister act to the 64 Act that created much more restriction on how you could use the landscape. And the big items out of this one were that it prohibited the use of motors on boats in the majority of the wilderness area. And in lakes that they were still allowed to use motors, they were limited to between 10 and 25 horsepower motors on portions of those lakes. Now Dorothy, because by this time had been granted lifetime tenancy and had actually been made a volunteer in service for the Forest Service, was allowed to use one motor, and she and her immediate family could use it. But it still made it really difficult for getting supplies, because usually what would happen was not just her and her nieces and nephews, but her friends and colleagues that would come to visit her would bring her supplies. And so now the big stuff, like fuel or oil for lamps or propane for her appliances, had to come up in the wintertime by snowmobile. But that also was going to be ending too after January 1st, 1984. So as that time rolled around and got closer, the Forest Service did get concerned about how Dorothy was going to be able to manage in the wintertime without getting those supplies. And so because she had developed these very close and deep relationships with the Forest Service, I mean, they went through a lot together. They made special concessions for her quite a bit of the time. And so taking a plane in and landing it on the lake, yeah, we could do that for Dorothy. You know, giving her a two-way radio so that she can touch base with us, or if she needs something, we can bring it to her. Yeah, we'll let Dorothy do that. So they were actually very generous with her and wanted to make sure that she had what she needed and she wasn't cut off from the other people that wanted to connect with her and that could no longer visit her, especially during the winter time. But that certainly didn't stop people from visiting her, especially in the summer. She had thousands and thousands of people coming every year, and we have thousands and thousands of pictures just like this in our collections database at the museum. We also have a very, very healthy archive collection of newspaper clippings, magazines, various publications that were made that included Dorothy, and had some pictures that, in some cases, these are the only pictures like this that we have of her. But just doing normal day-to-day things, highlighting some of the things that Dorothy really enjoyed, like gardening. Anybody can guess the famous person other than Dorothy in this picture, you get a free bumper sticker. There it is. So Julia Roberts, when she was 16 years old in 1984, was on a youth trip. Is that over? There you go. She's on the left with the yellow rain suit. We often joke about sending her publicist a letter with a photo, like, hey, if you ever want to contribute to a meaningful organization or do a special event. Yeah, so there might be more people that are now famous or were famous at one time, but the one thing that we see in all of these pictures is that Dorothy has this giant smile on her face. She was always very welcoming. Unfortunately, just like everybody, our time comes to an end at some point. And for Dorothy, it was December of 1986. And I just realized this was a really sharp shift in my presentation, so I apologize for the lack of kind of segue into this part of the story. But that two-way radio that the Forest Service had given to Dorothy, the way that they communicated was fairly regularly, usually not every day, but usually every other day. They would connect in some way. And for whatever reason, in mid-December, they hadn't heard from Dorothy in a couple of days. And they weren't alarmed because it wasn't unusual. You know, she might be out hunting, or they were out of the office when she tried to touch base. But when the following week, Monday came around and they still hadn't heard from her, they decided to plan a trip, just to check, to be safe. Dorothy was 79 at this time. She was still living at the Isle of Pines year-round on her own, although many of her siblings would, especially her dad and stepmom as well, would spend summers with her, and then eventually, once their children are older, they might spend the winter with her. By this time, it was just Dorothy. Her siblings had either passed or it was too hard for them to stay up during the winter. And so they got in the plane, and this group of people flew out to Knife Lake, and as soon as they got over Knife Lake and they saw that there was no smoke coming out of Dorothy's chimney, they knew that something had happened. And so they found her. She had passed. She was hauling in firewood to her cabin, and it was estimated it was likely a heart attack, and it just happened fairly quickly, and she was gone. And for her entire life, everybody that was close to her had ever talked about this with her knew that her wish was to be laid to rest next to her mom. And so after a formal service down in Chicago with the family, Dorothy was laid to rest out in the Arnold, New Kensington, Pennsylvania cemetery next to her mom. So if you wanted to see it, that's where you need to go. But because a lot of her friends and supporters in the Ely area either couldn't make it to Chicago for the service or felt like they needed something where she lived in the place she loved, they coordinated a memorial service and got permission from the Forest Service for a one-day pass from sunup to sundown to take snowmobiles up to the Isle of Pines. And so they planned this huge party with formal memorial service, booyah, which is basically just stew for everybody, coffee, probably some alcohol, probably looking for some overly fermented root beer bottles in the ice house, ice fishing, and just basically gathering and sharing memories and experiences about Dorothy. And it's estimated that on that day, between 500 and 1,000 people stopped by to pay their respects to Dorothy. Now, of course, this was a big trip, 15 miles just from the landing where you can get your snowmobile. Was a pretty long trip, and a lot of people couldn't make it. So they also had a service in town at one of the local churches. And in that way, everybody, including those with some physical limitations, were able to go. And so at the luncheon after, her very good friend Peg and her husband John Rosette were talking with some other folks that were friends with Dorothy, and they came up with the idea of a memorial site for remembering Dorothy. And it took a little planning, but shortly after, maybe a week or two, they went to the Forest Service and they said, we have this idea, if we can salvage what we can from Isle of Pines, we want to store it and eventually have some kind of memorial site established. And so with the full support of Dorothy's family, the Forest Service granted them a window through the spring to go up and salvage what they could, but they had to do it with non-motorized transportation. So, some very, very generous volunteers got together. The dog sled coordination was done by Bert Hyde from the Voyager Outward Bound School, which is located just south of Ely. And then the Charles Sommers Canoe Base, which is now called Northern Tier, it's a high adventure Boy Scout base on Moose Lake, coordinated lodging and storage space for everything that was brought down. And so they spent the better part of 3 months going back and forth and back and forth over the weekends on their personal time to bring back all of these items, which included 3 of the historic cabins, thousands and thousands of Dorothy's personal and resort items, photos, guest books. One of the things that Dorothy started doing in 1955 was keeping notebooks out by where she would sell the root beer for people to sign in that they had stopped and visited, which is why we know how many people visited her. However, as usually happens in Minnesota, we had a spring thaw in March, and it really degraded the portages. You can see in the upper right picture, it's bare ground, which when you are hauling out multiple logs from log cabins can be really heavy. So this group went to the Forest Service one last time and they were like, man, we have some major items to get out, but we just can't get in there. And they were able to work out permission with the Forest Service to have a 3-day weekend where they could take up ATVs, the trailers, and do a big push to get the last remaining items off of Knife Lake and down to Ely. So it took a little while. The committee that had formed to do this effort eventually organized and created the Dorothy Moulter Memorial Foundation, which was the official nonprofit name, and then worked with the city of Ely to rebuild one of the cabins. And they had it at our Chamber of Commerce for a short time, but it really didn't provide opportunities for interpretation and education about this story. So the city worked out a deal with the foundation to have a permanent display area where they could actually create an interpretive museum. And so on Dorothy's birthday, May 6th, 1993, the Dorothy Moulter Museum opened its doors to the public to interpret our wilderness heritage through the story of Dorothy Moulter, with the goal of inspiring the next generation to be good Northwoods stewards. And so that's what we still do. This is our 25th year. We have changed quite a bit. I know one person I talked to here had been to the museum several years ago. Every year we try to add new things and change things because we are extremely small. We have the 3 cabins and then an interpretive center. The interpretive center is the one in the upper left. It's basically a glorified gift shop area with some displays, historic displays in there. But we have renovated that space, so now since 2013 we actually have running water and an indoor toilet, which is super nice. We have an office, which is in the basement, that has heat, which is also very nice in the winter time because our administrative staff is there year round. And then the 3 cabins. This is the front of the winter cabin. If you notice, the steps, the deck is coming off the front straight out rather than to the side like it was in the historic picture. We've got the point cabin, which was that guest cabin that was on the point of the island. That has an exhibit about living at the pace of the seasons in the wilderness, and it features 15 minutes of that documentary. We have the Katy Cabin exhibit, which has our new exhibit this year called Creating the Boundary Waters, 25 Objects, 25 Stories, which is a timeline of different natural and cultural actions that took place to ultimately create the Boundary Waters as a wilderness that we know today. And we paired it with 25 of our collection items. One of those is that Sigurd Olson book I mentioned. Another is the two-way radio that Dorothy communicated with. We also have Bill Bergland's 1929 pocket journal when he was helping the local game wardens look for poachers that were illegally trapping beaver because the Minnesota beaver population was in such decline. So some really neat, precious things that we have in our collection are in that brand new exhibit. And then the winter cabin is set up similar to how it was when Dorothy lived in it, so that we have a piece of Dorothy's personality in an exhibit, and you can immerse yourself in her as a person after you get to know her from watching the video. We also do a children's camp in the summer called Camp Put Your Belly Aching. And sometimes there's a lot of put your belly aching during that, so it fits really well. This year we launched a new program called Brew It Yourself, where we make root beer and you can take home your own 32 ounces of homemade root beer using Dorothy's recipe. We also do various community events every year in the summer. Our season is Memorial Day weekend through Harvest Moon, which for Ely, Harvest Moon is bigger than Labor Day. It's just the weekend after Labor Day. But we're open daily during that time, and once a month, usually on a Sunday, we have a free day, and it's themed, and we do a fundraiser. One of the things that we try to do to give back to the community and to honor Dorothy is we have a Wilderness First Responders Scholarship. And every year we give out $1,000 in scholarship to people that are looking to take classes or do something to educate themselves in the medical field. A lot of them have been going to folks taking Wilderness First Responder or Wilderness First Aid classes. And so a fundraiser might be to raise money for the scholarship. We also do a Donuts at Dorothy's Day, because it's fun to just get together and have coffee and donuts. That's what Dorothy used to do. So we try to do those community events regularly, and then if you ever think about visiting Ely in the winter, we have a winter festival that is super fun, and we have our annual fundraising dinner in February. So if you're ever around, let us know, even if we're not open. We always do try to open for groups, so if you've got a family trip or you're a teacher and you're bringing school kids to the area, because to be honest, the big attractions are the Wolf Center and the Bear Center. We're like the little sandwich thing in the middle. So we try to grab onto the school groups and say, no, come look at us, come check us out too. So even though we close down in the wintertime, we will open for special groups. So give us a call if you think you might be coming. But if you wanted to go up to the Isle of Pines and see the islands for yourself, you would leave Ely and take the Fernberg Trail, which is also Highway 169, and you would drive about 15-20 miles to the end of Moose Lake Road to the Moose Lake Landing. It's a public boat access. From that boat access, you are going to jump in a canoe and paddle the remaining 15 miles, following that white dotted line all the way up to Knife Lake, Isle of Pines, all the way paddling in Portage. Unless it's winter time and you choose to go by dog sled, which still is about the same distance, just a few different portages, because you can shave off a little bit of time going through some frozen swamps. However, once you get there, it's very difficult to tell if you've never seen pictures or been there before. For about 10 years after Dorothy died, there was a sign that the Forest Service placed that said, "This is the former home site of Dorothy Moulter. You are welcome to pay your respects, but please no camping." It disappeared. Either it rotted or fell or someone took it, which probably is what happened. But there is still no camping allowed on the Isle of Pines. But what you can look for in the spring, there's a very large lilac bush, both on the point where the point cabin used to be, and on the easternmost satellite islands, which is where Dorothy would sell her root beer and stay in a tent in the summertime, so she could rent out the other cabins. And the Ribbon Rock, which is a formation of magnetite, jasper, and chert. It's a metamorphic rock that got all squished with heat and pressure to make these mineral bands look like ribbons. Sometimes it's referred to as rainbow rock. But this particular rock was actually moved there by Dorothy's nephews for her birthday. In the process, they put holes in a really nice fishing boat because it weighs about 400 pounds. And so to get back at them, she had them put it here, and then she said, no, I don't like it there, put it over here. No, maybe put it over here. And she did that about 4 times. So now it's still there because nobody else is going to move it. It's on the north side, in between, kind of by the 2 smaller satellite islands there. There's also an English rosebush on one of the small islands, and then I've heard that there's still some perennial lilies popping up because Dorothy, Lori's my root beer wholesale manager. Dorothy did have beautiful flower gardens that she would plant in old boats. So some of those flowers still survive if you're there at the right time of the year. And Dorothy's memory is still there. And I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of the program, but one of our biggest purposes is not just to share Dorothy's story, but to inspire people with it. Dorothy really represents the Ely area's kind of struggle with what happened with the federal government, with the state government, with all of the controversy. All through it, Dorothy maintained her dignity, and she was kind, even though some people say she had a shotgun out, but she was very kind to everybody, even when other people were telling her things that she didn't want to hear with this process. And so the way she approached this challenge, the way she persevered through it, we can all aspire to do the same thing with such great grace and dignity as she did. And she also lived such an unconventional life for the time that she was born and raised in. We really find that she's inspiring for young women, especially, who maybe aren't sure, they don't want to go against the grain because that's not what everybody else is doing or what they think they should do. And Dorothy is a really great example and role model for people struggling with what path to take in their life. And so I hope today I didn't get too terribly long-winded. It's very hard for me not to because it's such a passionate story. So thank you. And for those of you that need to leave and go do other things, it's about 25 after 2. Please don't feel awkward going, but I will stick around if folks have questions as well.
Thank you